grab your seats, we'll get started. I'm Cornell Clayton, I'm the director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our Coffee and Politics today. And I just want to I'll remind you again at the end, that we have another event at 4 o'clock over in Kew this evening. That event will be talking about the role of the White House press secretary, as I said, the legal counsel's office, which tells you what I study, the White House press secretary. But this afternoon, we're very fortunate to have with us Robert Mann. Bob holds the Douglas Manship Chair of Journalism at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, and he is a political columnist for the New Orleans Times. Bob is the former director of LSU's Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs, and he is also a former communications director to Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco. Prior to this, Bob worked for 17 years as a state director and press secretary to U.S. Senator John Breaux of Louisiana, and he also served as press secretary for 2 other U.S. senators. So join me now in welcoming Bob Mann.
Thanks, Cornell. Thank you all for inviting me here today. Delightful campus and a delightful city. I really have enjoyed my brief time here so far. How many of you are familiar with the Daisy Girl spot? How many of you have seen it in classes and all of that? So I want to just start off by showing it to you, and then sort of give you maybe a little bit of the background. But I think it would be good just to sort of have it fixed in our mind before we talk about it. So I published a book about this spot, and I had a hard time in the beginning selling my agent on the idea of a book about a single television spot. He thought that's a magazine article, and the more I dug into it, the more I was convinced that it was a book, that this was a spot that had a tremendous impact on political advertising, the way that politicians talk to the voters, their constituents, the way that candidates forevermore communicate in campaigns was changed by the way that Lyndon Johnson ran against Barry Goldwater in 1964. So on the night of September 7th, 1964, it's hard to sort of imagine that's when the spots started running. No one had run any spots until September of that year. You know, we're used to sort of the nonstop campaign, and the spots have already started. But they waited until 2 months before the election to start running the spots in this campaign. And this was the very first spot that was run in the campaign by Lyndon Johnson against Barry Goldwater, and it's widely commonly known as the Daisy Girl spot. And here it is.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Is it possible to get a little more volume on the next one? Okay. So that spot was taking advantage of something that was already in the voters and the public's mind, which is what makes it so brilliant and so innovative. Today, I tell my students all the time that in politics no one ever really wins an argument. But we think that we can politicians especially think they can persuade people to do things, that we can give them facts and information and change their minds, and if we just give them enough facts and enough information, that we will persuade them to come over to our side, and that is a fundamentally flawed strategy, not only in life but in politics. You do not win arguments, and especially I think in campaigns, voters do not like to be told that they're wrong. I mean, just put it in your own experience. If I walked up to you, depending on your position on capital punishment, if I walked up to you and said, "You have 5 minutes so I can tell you how screwed up your views are on capital punishment," I mean, how would you respond? I mean, you would not. That would sort of not start off. That would not sort of set up for us to have a meaningful conversation about it. And I tell my students that, and I use this campaign as a good example of it, and that spot is a perfect example of it, that if you want to change people's minds about something, or you want to influence people's minds, or you want them, in this case, to feel, to have an emotion about an issue, you want them to have an emotional response and not an intellectual response, which by the way, I think in politics is what you really want, is the emotional response, not the intellectual response. You use you use information that you take advantage of what the audience already knows. You take advantage of sometimes the prejudices and the loves and the hates, the information that they already know. You put that to use. You put it into you give it some context. You build a story around what they already know. You take the information they already know, and the story that you give them sort of puts the facts into its proper place. Now, you might distort the story. You might distort the facts with your story in a way, but you're still trying to use what they know. You're not giving them any information. And that's what's so brilliant about this spot, I think, is that it took what the voters already knew about Barry Goldwater. Now, did you notice that this spot left out two things? Anybody notice what's not in this spot? First of all, yes, ma'am? Barry Goldwater, exactly. Barry Goldwater is not. This is an attack spot. This is a vicious attack on Barry Goldwater, and yet his name is not mentioned. His picture is nowhere there. I mean, there's nothing to mention. If you dropped into the United States from Mars in September of '64 and saw this, you have no idea what this was about, because it did not mention Barry Goldwater, and yet every American who saw this, and by the way, there were 50 million people who saw this that night. It only showed one time, but there were 50 million people who saw it, and probably another 50 million people who saw it later in the week when all three television networks aired the spot in its entirety on their newscasts. They all knew it was an attack on Barry Goldwater. And why did they know it was an attack on Barry Goldwater? Because Barry Goldwater, he was a Republican senator from Arizona, who was the Republican nominee, very conservative, sort of laid the groundwork for the resurgence, or laid the groundwork for the conservative movement that culminated in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Barry Goldwater had spent 5 years or more saying what I think almost everyone would agree were very, very reckless things about nuclear war and nuclear weapons and the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I'll just give you a few examples. This is just a sort of the tip of the iceberg of what Goldwater had been saying and what had been reported about Goldwater. So for example, when Kennedy made his announcement that we were going to send a man to the moon by the end of the decade, y'all remember that? When Goldwater was asked, Senator, what do you think about President Kennedy's call to send a man to the moon? And Goldwater responded, "I don't want to send a missile to the moon. I want to send a missile to the men's room of the Kremlin." When he was asked about what could we do in Vietnam, we got this growing problem in Vietnam. The war is brewing over there, and we've got all this problem with these, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong were bringing their supplies down through this trail into South Vietnam and engaging our forces. And so Goldwater is musing, well, we could use nuclear weapons to defoliate the forests. Just drop nuclear bombs and wipe out all the trees and expose the trail. He said the nuclear, the bomb was what he called it, merely another weapon, and you'll see how that was used in a spot in a second. He opposed and voted against the nuclear test ban treaty that President Kennedy negotiated and signed in 1962. He was very outspoken. He thought that we ought to continue having atmospheric nuclear testing, above ground testing. He thought that was a great idea, that the fallout really, the fallout from all this nuclear testing was not really that much of an issue. And on and on and on and on. Sort of culminating in July of 1964 when he stood before the delegates of the Republican convention in San Francisco and uttered those famous words, which some of you may have heard, that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. In other words, it was almost as if he was going to, and there were people, there was some reporter that I heard say that he turned, that this friend turned to him at the convention and said, "Oh my God, Barry Goldwater is going to run as Barry Goldwater. You know, he's actually going to, you know, sort of double down on what he's been saying. He really means it. You know, he really means that he's embracing the idea of I am an extremist." And so the Johnson people, really, this incredible advertising firm, Doyle Dane Bernbach, that the Johnson campaign hired to run his campaign, they understood that they didn't need to give the audience any really much information, if at all, about Barry Goldwater. They had to use, all they had to do was use what people knew about Barry Goldwater and build a story. And so that's why that spot doesn't mention Barry Goldwater, show his name, because everybody who watched it knew it was Barry Goldwater, and it had the charming effect of them being able to say, "We never said Barry. We didn't say Barry Goldwater. You said Barry Goldwater." You know, so because the Goldwater people started, the Republicans and the Goldwater people started screaming bloody murder about this attack spot, and the Johnson people were perfectly happy because they said, "Well, we didn't say it was about you. You said it was about you," which was sort of part of the beauty of the spot. They let Barry Goldwater say, "Yes, they're talking about me. Yes, they're saying I will blow up the world." It was such a clever strategy. We can argue about whether it was ethical. We can argue about whether it began the kind of negative, dirty campaigning that we all say we despise, but we really don't. We can say all that, but I think it's undeniable that it was a brilliant campaign. So let me just show you what most people know about the Johnson campaign in 1964 is that Johnson ran against Barry Goldwater, and he ran this spot, and it destroyed Barry Goldwater. What they don't realize is that Barry Goldwater was already destroyed. He had no chance to win. He was not going to win the election. He had already destroyed himself by what he had done and what he had said. He voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, for crying out loud. I mean, this guy was not going to win the election. The American people were not going to elect 3 presidents in the course of 3 years. You know, they weren't going to have. They were not. You know, Kennedy hadn't even been dead a year. They weren't going to change presidents 3 times. Barry Goldwater was not going to win. So the spot didn't destroy him. The spot just made it impossible for him to gain any momentum. So the following Monday, the Johnson campaign ran this spot.
Do you know what people used to do? They used to explode atomic bombs in the air. Now, children should have lots of vitamin A and calcium, but they shouldn't have any strontium-90 or cesium-137. These things come from atomic bombs, and they're radioactive. They can make you die. Do you know what people finally did? They got together and signed a nuclear test ban treaty, and then the radioactive poison started to go away. But now, there's a man who wants to be President of the United States, and he doesn't like this treaty. He fought against it. He even voted against it. He wants to go on testing more bombs. His name is Barry Goldwater, and if he's elected, they might start testing all over again.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
It's amazing stuff. All right, so then, as if that wasn't enough, I mean, I sort of see it as a prize fight where the first Monday night it was boom, and the second Monday night it was boom, you know, and they just kept coming at him. So here's what they came with next.
On October 24th, 1963, Barry Goldwater said the nuclear bomb, merely another weapon. Merely another weapon. Vote for President Johnson. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
And by now you think that this would be, you know, they would sort of made their point, but no, there's more.
This particular phone only rings in a serious crisis. Keep it in the hands of a man who's proven himself responsible. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
Remember, Hillary Clinton used that same technique against Barack Obama in 2008. There's I'm not sure if I have this one. And it's a long one, so I'm not going to show it to you. But they finally, sort of the grand finale of sort of the nuclear theme was a 4-minute spot that had alternating countdowns in Russian and English with a nuclear explosion. Boom. Countdown, boom, countdown, boom, countdown, boom, in Russian for about 3 minutes. Just count, just Russian countdown, English countdown, and then ended with President Kennedy, President Kennedy's voice from the speech that he gave when he signed the nuclear test ban treaty, and making the point that that if we don't stop this testing and if we don't elect the right person, that we're going to blow up the world. What's fascinating to me is that that after a month of this stuff, I went back and looked at all the polls that had been run by Harris and Gallup in that period. That what's fascinating about it is that Johnson's numbers actually went down about 4 points, and Goldwater's numbers actually went up a point or two. It didn't. The idea that these spots destroyed Goldwater just did not happen. The campaign sort of stayed where it was. The problem is where it was about 60-40, 65-35. Goldwater was never going to get, above 35. What these spots did was solidify. I think they increased the fear that Americans had that Goldwater would start a war, and they solidified in the American public's mind the idea of Goldwater as a reckless cowboy who would blow up the world. But the reason that the spots didn't destroy Goldwater, as I said, is that Goldwater had already destroyed himself. They could not bring his numbers down anymore. He was down to sort of immediate family by then, and they were not going to take any more off of him. But there were also very other reckless comments and controversial things that Goldwater said that the campaign put together. And I want to show you just a couple of those spots because I think they're creative. And in fact, if it weren't for the nuclear spots, I think this spot would be the spot that would be considered, the sort of the one of the great political spots of all time. It was produced. Most of these spots were produced by Doyle Dane Byrne. All of them were produced by Doyle Dane Byrneback. And the spot that I'm about to show you was produced by Sid Meier's, who was the art director for the firm and was sort of one of the account managers and the guy who actually put the spots together. And Sid came up with this. I've gotten to know Sid. He's still alive, a very spry, healthy, 81-year-old guy. And this spot was his idea, and it's brilliant, and it uses humor, and it leaves the viewer with an indelible image about the recklessness of Barry Goldwater. And by the way, I wrote a piece on this back during the campaign of 2012, and I can't remember in Politico or someplace, pointing out that this spot was sort of like Mitt Romney's 47% moment.
In a Saturday Evening Post article dated August 31st, 1963, Barry Goldwater said, "Sometimes I think this country would be better off if we could just saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea." And a man who makes statements like this be expected to serve all the people justly and fairly. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I think it was Maya Angelou who said it, but this spot is, I think, proof of that. People, I think she said, the way she put it was, people may forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Those spots gave people a feeling. They gave them a sort of an indelible image about giving them information. It was about giving them an image, and that's what's so brilliant about that spot. You don't see many. I have my students will look at spots and will time how many times the image changes in a 30-second spot, and often it's an average of every 2 seconds there's a new image on the screen, and I think these guys had something. They discovered something really fundamental about politics that maybe the political practitioners ought to rediscover, and that is the power of maybe one image indelibly etched on the public's mind instead of giving them 50 images and sort of a jumble of confusing messages sometimes. All right, so let me just one more spot, and then I want to show you just what was going on the other side, so you can get a sense of how creative these were, and how sort of dull and stuck in the past the Goldwater campaign was. Well, Goldwater also made some reckless remarks about Social Security. It was sort of the third rail of American politics 50 years ago. It still is the third rail of American politics. That really hasn't changed much. And this was the spot that they ran against Goldwater about his remarks about Social Security.
On at least 7 occasions, Senator Barry Goldwater said that he would change the present Social Security system. But even his running mate, William Miller, admits that Senator Goldwater's voluntary plan would destroy your Social Security. President Johnson is working to strengthen Social Security. Vote for him on November 3rd.
I read people at the time were saying that they had seen, I saw Barry Goldwater tear up a Social Security card. They thought the way they remembered it was Barry Goldwater went on television and tore a Social Security card in half. That was the image of it. So it wasn't the information so much; it was that image that indelible image of Barry Goldwater hating Social Security so much that he tears up a Social Security card. It was the Sid Meier's I told you about, that he tore up his own Social Security card. That was his Social Security card. All right. So what was Barry Goldwater doing? Barry Goldwater was running spots that were stuck in time. If you look at the Kennedy campaign in 1960, you look at the Nixon campaign in 1960, you look at Eisenhower and Stevenson in 52 and 56. They were all running spots that were very heavy on giving information, very heavy on, if I just sort of where I started. If I just give you enough information, you will submit. You'll admit that I'm right, and you'll vote for me. And that was sort of the philosophy that governed political advertising until these DDB people showed us that there was a different way to do it. And so this is one of the spots that Goldwater ran in running at the same time. In fact, I'll tell you a little bit of what these Goldwater spots sort of do is distort the view of distort the view of how Goldwater was really running, or the not the view of it, but the strategy of it. Because what Goldwater was really doing was buying up 30 minutes of time, preempting some show and showing a 30-minute commercial. And most of you are too young to remember the show Peyton Place, but it was sort of the first primetime soap opera. It became a very popular show back in the 60s. And one of the reasons why it was so popular was because Barry Goldwater started preempting time on the other networks, and people would say, "I'm not watching this crap," and there were only three stations, there were only 3 networks at the time, and so they were so desperate to get away from Barry Goldwater's boring crap that they found Peyton Place, and the producer of Peyton Place was quoted saying, thanking Barry Goldwater for helping the American viewer find his program, and because he thought that the only reason it happened is because Goldwater drove the audience away from him to this new show that they were trying to promote. So so Goldwater was not running a lot of spots like the Johnson campaign was running. He was preempting and running these long 30-minute, but to the extent that he did run spots, these are what they looked like.
Is moral responsibility our style? Our papers and our newsreels, and yes, our own observations tell us that immorality surrounds us as never before. We see violence in the streets, in our cities and suburbs, graft and corruption in the highest public offices to which we look for leadership, when scandal in local and national government has become so commonplace that many begin to consider it a way of life. Then I say that we, as a nation, are
far from the kind of moral decay that has brought on the fall of other nations and people. The philosophy of something for nothing, the cult of individual and government irresponsibility, is an insidious cancer that will destroy us as a people unless we recognize it and root it out now. I say it is time to put conscience back in government, and by good example, put it back in all walks of American life.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
Now, the one lesson that beyond beside the spot that was a really boring spot that tried to argue with you instead of leave you with an impression, that in your heart you know he's right. It took Johnson's people about 10 minutes to turn that around and say in your guts you know he's nuts. And then they had another one which I liked, which was a little more subtle, but it said in your heart you know he might. So that's the kind of stuff that Goldwater was running, and it was really stuck in time. And it's very, if you go back and look at, there's a great website called the Living Room Candidate that I know Travis knows about and probably uses in your classes. But if you go back to the Living Room Candidate, it has sort of the major spots from every presidential campaign from 1952 through 2012, and you can go look at what was running in 1952 and 1956 and 1960, and look at the rest of the Barry Goldwater spots in 1964, and see how stuck in time they were, see how different they were from the spots that DDB was running for Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and then jump ahead to 1968 and see how both campaigns suddenly got it. Both campaigns were running really creative stuff. Nixon's stuff is I think still pretty good stuff. It still holds up pretty well. Humphrey was running good stuff. In fact, Humphrey briefly hired DDB to do his spots in '68. But it changed the way. It fundamentally changed the way that politicians communicated with the public in campaign environments. And that's why I think that it really is my book said, it's the spot that changed American politics. So with that, I'll open it up for questions or accusations. Yeah.
Well, I have a question about the Eastern Seaboard ad in particular. You mentioned the possibility of using that single image as kind of leaving an indelible mark on the the viewership. But if we consider the contemporary context, do we also need to consider things like unofficial representatives for these candidates that can rebut these remarks? I'm talking about, in an era of more biased media, like you've got your left-wing and your right-wing sources that can kind of rebut these charges, would the single image be just easier to rebut because it's just one particular thing to...
That's a very good point, and that it is worth remembering that this was a simpler time where the campaigns were not nearly as sophisticated. They weren't, and certainly Goldwater's campaign was very disorganized to begin with. But there were three networks. We didn't have a fragmented media. There was no social media. There was no internet. There was basically there were newspaper ads and radio, maybe some radio, a lot of radio still, and television, and that was it. It was a very simple way to get your message out, very easy to communicate. Now now there would be an automatic, there would be a war room.
Right.
They would. Here's the crazy thing about it, and I'll go back to the Daisy Girl spot. The Goldwater people acted as if they were. I mean, they apparently were shocked that this spot came out. They were like, "Oh my God, what do we do?" And they floundered around. It took them a week to figure out what to say. Goldwater didn't respond to it for almost a week, I think, or more. But in my research, I found that the Wall Street Journal a week before had interviewed the DDB people who told them that they told them about the spot. They described it almost verbatim. Advertising Age also ran a lengthy story about this spot before it ran, and so if they'd just been paying attention, they would have, intuition should have told them what was coming.
Right.
But without even the intuition, if they'd just been reading the papers, they would have known what was coming and have responded. Now, Tony Schwartz, who was a guy who sort of took credit for the spot and was involved with it in some way, much less so than he claimed, But Tony Schwartz, who was a famous advertising man, he said what they should have done was buy time and the Goldwater campaign should have paid to air it 20 more times, because he sort of took the idea that habituation would have reduced the impact of the spot. People just saw it enough that it would sort of lost its impact. The fact that they only saw it once, sort of was like this bolt of lightning that would have been, that they could have diluted it if they had responded to it. But back to your point, they had no strategy. I mean, they didn't even, it wasn't like they had a bad strategy for responding to all this stuff. They had no strategy for how to rebut any of it, except say this is just dirty politics. That's about what they said. This is just dirty politics. They never came back and said, but what I really mean was this, or what I really said was that, or what. They didn't do much of that at all. They just said this is dirty politics, and as if the American people would rebel against it just because it was somehow negative campaigning. Yeah.
Was there any, obviously ads get more sophisticated after this on both sides of the aisle, but was there any evidence afterwards that there was an autopsy and the Republicans came together and said, well, we're going to have to step it up a bit, because you're right, absolutely right about those Goldwater ads. They're just so hokey, and Grandpa sitting in the in the study telling you about all the moral decay. Did they learn from it?
They did learn from it, yeah. And you talk to the Goldwater people or read what they wrote about it, they realized they were outclassed. So what happened up to that point? The way that these campaign spots were created was that the campaigns, the brain trust around the candidate would decide, here are the spots that we want to run. And they hired these media firms to just sort of take their orders. Look, here's what we want you to do. You go produce it. They were sort of just the functionaries. And what the brilliance of the Johnson campaign is they went and told DDB, you write the scripts, you come up with the ideas, you produce the spots, and what's fascinating to me is that Johnson, there were 2 spots that DDB proposed that they did not run. Out of 20, there were 28, I believe, and they ran 26 of them, or 29, and they ran 27 of them. I can't remember the exact number, but there was this meeting in the White House when Johnson, Bill Bernbach, who's the head of the firm, who was famous for firing clients if they disagreed with him. He was very sure of himself, and Johnson started to tell him, here's what I think you ought to do, and all that, and Bernbach said, Mr. President, let me stop you right now. Your job is to tell us what you want to say. My job is to tell you how to say it. And Johnson sort of laughed, kind of chuckled, and said, okay. And if you know anything about Lyndon Johnson, and I've written 3 books about him, you know that Lyndon Johnson was a micromanager. He was not a guy to turn over his affairs to other people to manage. And the fact that he let this firm do what they did with minimal interference is remarkable to me. It still stuns me that he did this, and why did he do this, and why did he trust these people so much? But what happened is, after that, everybody saw that if you want to win these campaigns, you got to hire people who know how to create. You got to hire creatives. That the person who can run a campaign is not necessarily the guy or the woman who can create the message. And these people on Madison Avenue are really good at selling soap and soup and cigarettes and all that, and they can sell candidates too. And they know how to sell products. And it was this paradigm shift of both parties sort of admitting that our candidate is basically a product. That our campaigns, our message is a product. And so why not? If we're going to sell it, let's go to the people who know how to sell products. And it really you still didn't have firms like you do now, where there's advertising firms that sell products, and Madison Avenue firms, and then there are media consultants that specialize just in political messages, and they don't tend to they either do one or the other. In the early days, it was the campaigns hiring Madison Avenue firms to advertise for them, and eventually it evolved into what we have today, which is political consultants who do nothing but primarily advertise ideas and candidates and political issues. But everybody saw what happened and said, this is how it's done. This is how forevermore be done. Yeah.
I was thinking about Don Draper, actually. In the
Yeah.
ad movies they take on in politics. But but in terms of the content of the ads, it seems to me the fundamental shift you're describing is the shift from informational advertising to emotional appeals. And so I'm curious your take on what we've learned, and it's clear that that's the way campaigns are run today, emotional appeals. What's your take on what we've learned about what works and doesn't work in terms of emotional appeals since then?
That's a very good question. So, Travis is probably a much better person to answer.
We hear him all the time.
I would love to hear. Honestly, I would love to hear what Travis has to say about that, because I'm not sure I have a lot to offer, except that I do believe that the emotion that this campaign applied or was trying to suss out of the American public was fear, primarily, and that it proved that fear is perhaps the most potent emotion in politics, and I think we still see it. I show so the DNA of this spot is in a lot of other spots. I think I show my students the spots from 1988 when George Bush was running against Dukakis and running the soft on crime, the Willie Horton stuff that Bush didn't originally run himself, but eventually adopted, and injecting fear. If you elect this guy, he's going to turn criminals loose and all that. And I think even today we see fear as being the emotion that most political advertisers shoot for, but not always. I mean, I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of other emotions, but I think this spot showed that fear may be the most powerful motivator in a political campaign. Did I come anywhere close to a cogent answer on this question, Travis?
No, I think that makes sense, and it depends on your goals too. Are you mainly about trying to make people rethink their choices? I think fear is good for that. Anger might be good for other goals, or enthusiasm, or pride, or so it just depends. I think the one other thing is, keep it to that one emotion. If you're throwing, 4 different emotional appeals, that's not going to work as effectively.
Yeah. This is sort of related to that, but I just published a piece in Salon over the weekend in which I quote extensively from this great book called The Selling of the President, that I'm sure you're familiar with, that Joe McGinnis wrote in 1969 about the 68 Nixon campaign. And they let this young journalist sit in their strategy meetings as they were talking about the media strategy for Richard Nixon, and his comeback from defeat in 1962 when he got defeated for governor, and this well-known candidate. I was trying to say that Hillary Clinton's people could learn a lot from how Richard Nixon won in 1968. But the memos in the back of that book, about a fourth of the book is in the appendix, is these memos that they gave to McGinnis, and they still hold these memos about sort of the strategy of how to use emotion, how to use impression, how not to argue with the audience, but how to use the emotion, how to use the information they already have to generate emotion. It's still brilliant insight. It still holds up really well, and it's a really short read. And I would urge any of you who are interested in getting into politics, interested in selling ideas, to go on Amazon and spend the $4 or $5 it would cost to buy a used copy of The Selling of the President and read that book. It will become your Bible. I carry it with me almost everywhere I go. In fact, I have a copy in my office and a copy in my house. I have a spare because I refer to it all the time. I can almost quote from it like some people can quote the Gettysburg Address. It has brilliant insights in it that still hold up really well. Yeah.
I have a very simple question. You mentioned that Goldman's was already finished by the time this even started. He'd already basically killed himself in the campaign. And Dick mentioned that after this aired, Johnson's support dropped a little bit. And so my question is about whether did this actually affect politics, or did it just affect political advertising?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And my argument is in the book that it did not affect the campaign that much. I mean, it did in the sense that any chance that Goldwater had, if Goldwater was ever going to surge in any way, which I don't think he was, but if he had ever had a chance to, that this ended this ended that chance. And looking at the numbers, while Goldwater's numbers did not change, and Johnson's numbers did not change, it went down a little bit. And I think it shows that negative campaigning sometimes hurts the person who's making the attack, as much or more than it hurts the person being attacked. But what it did do was what really shot up in the polls were the fears that the American people had that if Barry Goldwater or a Republican became president, that the U.S. would go to war with Russia or the Soviet Union. That it increased the fear of a nuclear war, increased the fear of a war with the Soviet Union. That's what it didn't hurt Goldwater's. It didn't hurt the impression of Goldwater so much, but it raised the level of fear. That emotion that those spots tried to elicit really did work, and I think that it solidified the negatives that people had about Goldwater. I mean, it sort of set them in concrete in a way that Goldwater could never get out from under them. He could never break loose from that image of himself as a reckless cowboy. The end of the story is that not the end of the story, but the end of the story about Goldwater in a way is that if you know anything about Barry Goldwater, it turned out that even the people around him, even the people around Johnson, like Bill Moyers and Sid Meier's and several of the others that I've interviewed, they all talk about how much they ended up admiring Goldwater. Goldwater was a really decent guy, and if he were still alive today, he would he would probably not be considered that much of a conservative in his party. He was one of the, way back before any Republican was willing to say so, Goldwater was for gays in the military. I guarantee you Goldwater would be for same-sex marriage today. Goldwater, they all sort of regretted what they did to Barry Goldwater because they ended up liking him so much because he really was a decent, honest man. And when I went to Washington in 1985 to work for Russell Long, his office was just down the hall. And one of the things it never occurred to me that I was going to write a book about this, 30 years later. But I so regret that I never, took the chance to strike up a conversation with him about this stuff because I would love. He wrote about it a little bit, but I would love to have had the chance to interview him. He was turns out he was not the monster that they portrayed him to be. And a lot of those people around Goldwater regret what they did. I mean, one in particular, Lloyd Wright, who was the media coordinator for the DNC, who was very involved in the creation of the spot. I took him out to dinner a few years ago in Washington, and he spent half the time sort of beating himself up for, he sort of blames himself for creating negative advertising. And I said, Lloyd, if Thomas Edison had not invented the light bulb, would we be sitting in the dark right now? I mean, of course, maybe you did invent it, but that doesn't mean that if you hadn't, someone else wouldn't have. I mean, it was, you didn't. It would have happened eventually. Don't quit beating yourself up. Yeah.
I'm wondering your thoughts on. I get it that the advertisers are not trying to argue or provide information, but they're taking place in a particular context. The intellectual context of the country at that time was a very liberal one. It was an intellectual elite. And I'm thinking in particular about Hofstadter's book, The Paranoid Style. He's writing about Goldwater. Those guys, right? But so these would have bite in that kind of an intellectual climate and context. Today, it seems to me the intellectual climate is much less homogenous, much more heterogeneous, and there's intellectual support on both sides.
Right.
And so I wonder if these types of appeals can have the same bite today.
Yeah, I doubt it, and I think that you're giving context that I didn't give in the beginning that I should have, and if I was trying to sort of rush through this, I would have maybe paused to point out that, first of all, Lyndon Johnson was running for re-election, and I did mention this, a year after Kennedy had been assassinated. So this was, he was running to carry on he was carrying the torch for this martyred president. This thing happened. All these spots were running, 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I forgot to mention, by the way, which the American people thought that we were on the verge of destroying each other in a nuclear exchange. And so, I think that, the issues of sort of war and peace or nuclear war versus figuring out a better way we're pretty with a strong delineation between the two. There wasn't much in between on those issues, which, and I find it, maybe where you were going with this question is that, look at today and the discussion about what we should do with Iran and their nuclear weapons. I mean, the issues are not nearly as clear cut. Back in, if that debate had been happening a year or two after we had almost gone to war with the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba, the American people might have a little bit different opinion about whether we ought to, go to war with Iran over these nuclear weapons or not, and start something that spins out of control. And so, yeah, I mean, I think your point is dead on.
And I also wonder whether someone like Ted Cruz would run an ad embracing getting rid of the eastern seaboard of the United States. That might be something to run on in today's climate.
Well, I mean, you could argue that the Republican Party has already sawed off the eastern seaboard pretty much. I mean, they've written it off, and you could argue that the Democratic Party has sort of written off the South too. I'm not picking on the Republicans. I mean, we're a much more divided country in that way.
But they want to saw off the West. They want to saw us off too. So.
That's right. Yeah.
Actually, speaking of Dr. Clayton's point about the heterogeneity of ideas that exist, would we start maybe seeing these types of ads shifting from kind of the general presidential election to the more primary presidential election? Because there are at least two instances just from Rand Paul's fledgling campaign that I can think of that kind of mirror other instances of kind of highly salient political ads in the past. I think one of the PACs ran a kind of a Daisy Girl style rum mushroom cloud ad against Rand Paul's stance on the Iran negotiations. And there was a video that Rand Paul even ran during his initial event that had Chris Christopherson and Mickey Rourke play acting what was very similar, at least in kind of setting, to Trent Lott's Black Hands ad, minus the racial component. But so I'm just wondering, if are we seeing this style of advertising moving more towards the primary campaign, where there isn't as much of a heterogeneity of ideas and more kind of a split between how you can apply labels to one?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's exactly right. And something else we're seeing, by the way, that I think should be pointed out, that I think sort of deals, is the way that politicians are going to deal with that, is that you already are seeing, I mean, everyone in this room, let's say we're in the midst of the presidential campaign, and everyone in this room goes to, I don't know, we all go to the same website, CNN.com or Yahoo, or some the New York Times or BuzzFeed or whatever. There's a good chance that a third of you are going to see one spot, a third of you are going to see another spot, you're all going to be you might be looking at the same exact content, but before you can look at that content, you're going to be shown a different spot from a different candidate that's targeted directly at you because of what I think we're all aware how much of our privacy we've given up on the internet, and how much people know about us, how much the advertisers know about us, and so they're able to much more sophisticated than I think we really realize. They're able to target ads to us, and you will very, very, very soon, I think, maybe as soon as this 2016 election, certainly by the 2020 elections, the cable companies. There are already places in the country where the cable companies can do this. Sam and Travis may live next door to one another, and Sam may be a Republican, Travis is a Democrat, and they may be watching the same show at the same time and seeing two different political spots, one aimed to you, one aimed to you. And very soon you're going to see that because the cable company is going to know everything it needs to know about Sam, going to know everything it needs to know about Travis to target a spot exactly to you. It's, this what I think is called long tail nano targeting, where as many as 100 different messages sent to 100 different sort of demographic groups. This micro targeting, that's what I think. That's the new innovation in all this. It's we're going to talk about a fragmented electorate. Where everybody in America saw this. Today it would only be a certain kind of person who was fearful of nuclear war who would see this, or a certain kind of demographic, and other people. It's sort of, to me, like the direct mail of television. Direct mail is used in that nefarious way where you send these really nasty messages that only you see and your neighbor doesn't get it because you're the type of voter that they want to send a message to. Television is going to happen like that, and I think that's going to make the spots even nastier and dirtier, and they'll be able to get away with a lot more than they are because not everybody can see what they're doing.
So we have time for one more question. Has one? If not, then before I ask you in joining me in thanking Bob for a great presentation, let me just remind you again, if you want to hear more tonight, at 4 o'clock in Q, we'll have a forum discussion on the role of the White House legal counsel, or White House press secretary. And Bob will be speaking at that, but so too will be Scott McClellan, who was George W. Bush's White House press secretary, and also Larry Pintack, who's the dean of our Murrow College of Communication and was a former CBS reporter himself. So that should be a really interesting discussion. I encourage you to come to that. But now, join me in thanking Bob for a really interesting conversation.